So good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be with you. I'm just gonna make sure I have, okay, great. I can see your cameras now. It's just way nicer if I see your faces, so I know if I lost you completely or not. Feel free to turn on your cameras if you want to. Thank you. It's just great to see when I use acronyms, not on purpose, and then I realize because all your faces have changed, and that means I'm not making sense anymore. So as it was briefly mentioned, my name is Aliénor or Ali Rougeot. I go by she, her pronouns, and I graduated from U of T last year, or I guess this year, and I now work at a nonprofit called Environmental Defense, where I'm a program manager on climate and energy files. But tonight I'll be speaking much more from, I guess, my perspective as a longtime activist and as someone that's really been active in Toronto and on U of T campus through the Youth Climate Strikes movement. So let me just make sure my notes are there. And I apologize for having to look at notes. As you know, we just had a federal election and that messed with my brain a lot because I think about climate policy all the time. So just very briefly, so you know kind of how I came to this topic. I started very young caring about environmental issues and human rights issues. When I started organizing, I was part of larger groups, and some of the big topics I cared about initially were women's rights and refugee rights, because I lived near the Mediterranean Sea. And in that context, I really learned to understand human rights issues. And it's in that moment that I heard about climate change. And so it's through a lens of caring about humans that I first started getting involved in the environmental movement, and so in this sustainable sphere. And I mention it because sometimes we portray or we imagine, or maybe those climate activists that really just are obsessed with nature and they're nature people, and so that's what spoke to them. And that can be super unrelatable for a lot of us that are not nature people. And so we're like, how am I supposed to care about sustainability and do something sustainable if we're not those people? And so I really want to flag that. I wish I had been, but I wasn't raised in a way that was really close to nature. And I kind of got close to it once I understood the importance that it had for human health and rights. So it's really through that lens. And then eventually I kind of had to progress from, okay, I care about climate because I care about humans. What do I do? And so I did all my little lifestyle changes, stopped eating meat, and then I stopped eating dairy and all the rest. And so had this lifestyle. Then I stopped buying new products. And then I, tried to reduce all my waste. And it got really tiring and overwhelming because I still saw that things were going the wrong way. But I was like, I can't do more than this. What am I going to do? Not heat my home. It just didn't make sense. And so you get to the block where you realize your individual lifestyle can't do anything. And that's where I started orienting myself towards those systemic versions of creating change. And for me, it was activism through youth climate strikes, but I know through others, and I'd be really curious to hear from others and to read more from the other speakers after. How sometimes it can be through entrepreneurship and creating the solution so that people don't have to struggle to live sustainable lifestyles. So just before I go into this a little bit more, I'm wondering from a show of hands or something in the chat, wondering how many of you have actually been to a youth climate strike or a climate demonstration, a rally, protest, anything that would kind of fall under that realm. So you can just raise your hand if your camera is on, or just kind of say yes. Michelle, good to know that you've been. That's awesome. Delphine as well, amazing. Great, yeah, some of you I'm pretty sure I've even seen at climate strikes. Okay, that's really encouraging. And shameless plug that for those of you that haven't been, there's actually one on Friday. So there you go, you have your first opportunity of going. But yeah, today I want to speak a lot more about, first of all, a little reminder about the state of the world and where we are at when it comes to climate. I think we hear about it often enough that it's a little easy to lose track of where the progress is at. So hopefully I can give you a bit of a reminder, even though it's not a fun one. And then I really want to talk about how much this conversation matters, how much sustainability is more than just a business opportunity. It is a business opportunity, but there's that moral imperative that comes in, and that's what I'm kind of hoping to bring here, and tell you a few do's and don'ts that I've seen kind of from my exterior perspective, and hopefully you can get an interior perspective from the other folks. Okay, so if that sounds good, I'll just talk about quickly the state of the world. No, nothing smaller than that. To put it simply, we are not doing very well on climate. I think those of you that follow it closely will know this very well, because there's those UN reports that regularly come out, and they try to use starker and starker language to tell you that we're not doing well. And so they'll be like code red and emergency and it's a disaster. What I find useful to understand is, for example, like in terms of warming, where we thought we were a few years ago compared to where we're going now. That might be a good understanding of how fast things are accelerating and how out of control they are. So a few years back, everybody met in Paris. They agreed that 1.5 degrees of warming was this this goal that we should not reach within the next century, right? We should not have the world warm above 1.5 degrees. 2 weeks ago, scientists said, actually, we might reach 1.5 degrees within the next 8 years. That's a bit of a difference between end of the century and 8 years. And so the projection was, yeah, and by the end of the century, we're going to get more, close to 4 degrees or 3.6 to 4 degrees of warming. At 3.6 or 4 degrees, most of us could not recognize the cities that we've grown up in or lived in. I know that I wouldn't recognize the coast of the Mediterranean, and I'm sure, I don't know where you're all from, but there's many of the countries that you know and places you call home that just wouldn't be livable anymore. And so I think there's that sense of urgency and that sense of acceleration that we know of, but sometimes it's important to kind of root this conversation in the fact that scientifically, there's an obligation for us to do it. And so once we're going to be thinking about, business opportunities, business ways to deal with the solution, we have to remember that even if something seems a little impossible from the business side, it's surely more possible than living on a world that's four degrees warmer than this. And it's just kind of, situating where we're at and what we consider possible or impossible. I also want to flag a very sad thing, and we just had an election, so it might be important, is that it's easy to think, okay, surely if we're going to the 4 degrees of warming, someone's going to be taking care of it, right? We have leaders that are educated and they read the science and they have a bunch of advisors and someone's taking care of it. But in Canada, at least, and can't say that for everywhere in the world, but in Canada, at least, our leaders are particularly bad at addressing the climate crisis. And we're not going to talk about the reasons why today. This isn't about policy, but recently we were rated as highly insufficient by an international rating agency. Both our policies, our future plans, and our current actions were all rated as highly insufficient, which was actually worse than the notation that the US got. So really not a good place to be in. And again, kind of this shouldn't scare you. I hope this really makes you understand the importance of your own role and the importance of your own community, because no one else is taking care about it. And so we really have something that we want to do. And the last thing I'll flag is that we're continuing to ramp up and put money into the areas that are hurting us the most. The two biggest drivers of greenhouse gas emissions in that was really hard in Canada are the oil and gas sector and the transportation sector, which is really more of burning oil and gas. So just the production of oil and gas plus our cars and our trucks are kind of amounting to about 2/3 of our emissions. And so those are just pretty important numbers also to keep in mind, with agriculture being very close behind, and something else to think about. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too terrifying. Give me a thumbs up if you're still willing to listen to the end of this and motivating. Okay, great. So it's also good to know that I've seen a lot of folks kind of wanting to tackle this. From the business side, especially, it's been really interesting seeing investors all of a sudden care and just kind of like really rapidly and frantically look for solutions and places to put their money. And also businesses that all of a sudden have been wanting to shift their operations. I've also seen that done very poorly, meaning that you're kind of looking for a way to have a quick fix to a situation that is complex and that has been created over decades and has many root causes to it. And so again, if someone is selling you a solution that's going to fix it all, you should probably be cautious of that and know that that's not going to go well. So now moving into where I see, at least from my external perspective, the business community go in. For me, the first idea to understand is that sustainability is a term we use because it is easy to understand. It's actually familiar to the business community before talking about the environment. I mean, sustainable growth just meant that growth that you can sustain over time. It was important before we even understood the environment. But when you actually try to implement it, I really encourage you to think about regeneration. And I don't know how familiar you are with that word, but sustainability will just mean, well, you're able to continue doing what you're doing. But if we're already in a world where ecosystems are already harmed, things are already damaged, communities are already broken by existing businesses and operations, we don't want to sustain that. Okay, we don't want it to get worse, but we also just don't want to stay at this level. So I like to think about regenerative business, regenerative economics, because businesses have the power to regenerate. Giving good jobs to communities that didn't have that before is regenerating a community, right? A business that actually cleans up damaged ecosystems, that's regeneration. And so for me, that is a really awesome and hopeful way of thinking about the contribution of the private sector, because it's like, well, we actually have the power to give back truly, and not just limit our damage, which would be so sad to just think the best I can do is not do too much harm. I also want to say that we might want to strive to do more than just leaving a net zero impact. This net zero context is one that businesses love, and governments also love it, because net zero means you can continue doing some of the bad stuff as long as you find one way somewhere else to do some good stuff. But if you've ever, damaged a relationship with someone, you'll understand that it's really hard to make up for the bad stuff, even if you give a lot. And maybe from the outside, it'll be net zero, but really you've created harm. So I also encourage you not to allow that messaging of net zero to come into play and say, no, we're actually going to get to zero impact, zero emissions, or a positive impact on the world. And that sounds really, really theoretical, but I'm sure, especially if you're applying for jobs or internships in the sustainable world, you're going to be able to tell apart the companies that are really trying to play on the net and are just trying to, make sure they have a good carbon policy, but then still use a lot of fresh water. And then the companies that are actually trying to look at a whole of production cycle aspect, for example. I also want to say that as students from business, I came from economics at U of T actually, so not exactly the same. We tend to think that we are a little more like representing the system and trying to, improve the system. And sometimes we feel a little defensive when someone will criticize the system, because that's what we are in. But we're allowed to rethink it. That doesn't mean that you're being unfaithful to your field. Investors and innovators are the folks that can actually get us into new system thinkings. And so one of the examples for businesses is new ways to govern businesses. Obviously, the cooperative model is like the most maybe known and famous and obvious one, but there might be many others in which the governance of your company in itself is an act of sustainability or an act of revolution or an act of outside thinking. So yeah, this is just, again, really my call in to you, especially the creative folks here, to really think of yourself as not needing to represent the system or feel like you have to protect this, because you can have a business and not be okay with everything that our current economic system represents. More than that, and sorry if this almost sounds like a laundry list of thoughts, but really I think this is what I can contribute way more than a step-by-step guide on how to create your business. I want to talk about mission-driven companies, because that's fascinating to me. I've seen more and more companies that are switching not only, a bit of CSR or a bit of having philanthropy on the side, to making their business pitch, in those 3 minutes, they talk about the mission that they have in the world. And I'm sure that's something that Michelle is going to be able to talk about, and Nuha as well, is the fact that at the core, at the main objective is actually that mission. I find that fantastic. And I think that that's really where we're going to be going when it comes to sustainability. And it's not just going to be having a sustainable department and then your normal operations. And again, I think, especially if you're thinking, do I create a business or do I want to work for a business that has sustainability? Look if it's in their core messaging or if it's like a side thing. And that to me is so impactful. And I realize it when I speak to these people after, because these people are very interested in having climate activists kind of sponsor them or approve them. And the first thing I'll look is it your primary objective, or did you think about it at the end when you realize you weren't doing so well otherwise? Another one I'll say is that there's some hard truth. There's some hard truth that some industries are going to go down. That's difficult to hear, but some industries just do not belong in a sustainable world. Coal, I think we can all agree. Oil and gas, some will challenge me on that, but most of the scientists agree that doesn't belong in a sustainable world, not for the long-lasting future. And so some companies can claim to have sustainable business models, but if they deny the fact that some of their activities at least will have to completely be phased out at some point, then you're getting close to impact washing or greenwashing, because again, that it's very important for them to realize that being aligned with the science has to go all the way. If your company's supposed to slowly go down, then being, in that case, being a responsible leader of those companies means that. The second hard truth is that we're going to need to change our metrics. And there's some folks that are going to have to be pioneers. It's really hard to tell maybe your potential investors, yeah, I don't make as much profits as that other companies, but I make all these other benefits to society. That's kind of hard. Like, I don't think that's what you want to pitch originally to someone. And those metrics are going to change. I really believe so. I think a lot of investors are getting there. But you're going to kind of have to be that activist, and we all are. And hopefully activists like me can help make that easier for you. But there's going to be that pioneering moment that's going to be difficult. And again, I'm sure our entrepreneurs here know, because they've had to pitch that, I'm sure. Last, let me check how I'm doing on time. Maybe the other things I'll mention here is how much of a red flag it is when I see a marketing department and a sustainability department be combined. And that should be a red flag to you too. Sustainability is in the operations of the business. Sustainability is in what you produce. If the supply chain doesn't have a sustainability lens, it's not the marketing or the comms person, maybe even the public relations person that has to come in with that. And you cannot imagine how many times I've been contacted to help sponsor a product or things like that, because they think it'd be fun to have a kid with a megaphone on their website. And I ask them, how are you sustainable? And it's not at all in the business. It's maybe just at the very end. And again, so really, really looking at, is the mission, is the core point of your business what's happening, is what's being sustainable, or is it the kind of the wrapping on top of it? And the last few parts I'll mention is, and that's something that I'll actually get into more, hopefully in the breakout room, is the interaction between those sustainable businesses and the rest of the world. So sustainable businesses and activists, sustainable businesses and governments. What is that interaction? Because it's not an easy one. Hopefully we can all agree that the government and private sector are not in opposition. I think that's an old idea, that it's like private sector and public sector are kind of always competing, and one is always trying to intrude on the other. Hopefully that's not where we're at anymore. But to me, it's really important that companies at their core respect that some things should be governmental, that some things belong to public policy, that some elements should not be privatized. And on the other side, I think governments need to understand that sometimes businesses are better at doing things than governments are. And I think, again, if you can really kind of advocate for that and understand that as a business, you can be lobbying for more sustainable laws, you should not be lobbying for privatization of some things, even if you think they're sustainable, right? That also, for me, is part of sustainability. At least it's respecting kind of the broader order of things, and with that, making sure that businesses don't get into the trend of thinking that because what they produce or do is good, everything else is automatically good. And I'll give you a few examples here. The first one is businesses that will very easily take subsidies from government because the outcome of what they do is good. But those subsidies end up going to shareholders and not maybe to the workers or things like that. That happens a lot. My day job is working with workers on a just transition plan to get them out of the fossil fuel industry. And it happens a lot that companies will kind of claim that they're turning towards green, get a lot of money, but give it back to shareholders. that's not sustainable in any way. And that's very just disrespectful as well. Um, and we also see a lot of work that is, for example, in renewables or in clean tech. But it ends up being very, very difficult and sometimes dangerous work for workers or for women, for marginalized communities. That happens a lot where the end product is good, it's sustainable, it's wonderful for the environment, but the entire functioning of the company is oppressive, it's harmful. To me, that's also not climate justice, and that's not sustainable. And so, yeah, I'll wrap it up here. So this is my long laundry list of things that I hope we can think about when we think about sustainable businesses and what it means for you folks in the community. If there's any questions or if there's things you want to challenge me on, please do. I love that, and you'll probably help me think more through these points. And I look forward to speaking to you in the breakout room or in the networking session. Thanks so much.